Hello, YouTube. The following is going to be a reading of The Method of Creation in Perfumery by Jean Carles. It's an article written in 1961. It was published in the 68 yearbook issue of Soap, Perfumery, and Cosmetics. I got this copy on perfumersapprentice.com if you want a paper version of it to read. The reason I'm reading this is because I was unable to find any audio version of it anywhere on the internet, and I thought it would be a good resource, assuming I'm allowed to do this. We'll find out. Listen to it in your car or whatever where you can't read safely. So without further ado, here we go. And I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations or or anything like that. I'm going to try to just read this in one shot. I'm going to break it into three pieces because I believe this is broken into three pieces, and I will upload them successively for your listening pleasure. But if I mispronounce anything or I read a sentence incorrectly, I'll just reread it because I'm just going to do this in one shot. You'll get the gist of it. The apprentice perfumer at the beginning of his career is like a ship without a rudder. If he is left to his own devices or badly led, his discoveries will lack organization and will lead him inevitably to wasteful and ineffectual use of his creative energy. In my early days on this rugged pathway, I found myself in the presence of tutors who seemed to have disregarded the necessity for basic rules and whose enthusiasm in our fate was of the mildest. Watching how they proceeded with their own work was not particularly enticing. They appeared to believe in a happy-go-lucky way of life, desultorily dipped smelling strips into the available samples of odorous materials, and thus their formulations progressed, small addition by small addition, and not according to some pre-established plan. Thus, in the past, most of the great perfume creations, or rather, of the commercially successful perfumes, were produced almost by chance, sometimes to the unfeigned surprise of their authors. Although such happy occurrences are always possible, a firm belief in them should not be the guiding rule. Since the trial and error method held no appeal for me, I attempted from the very outset of my career 50 years ago actually to understand the whys and wherefores of the fascinating world I entered for better or worse. This is why I feel I may now offer to share whatever experience I've acquired since with my younger colleagues, many of whom still work undirected and create in haphazard fashion in the expectation of a potential miracle. In perfumery, however, miracles are few and far between. From the very outset, a perfumer should be able to tell whether a creation stands a chance of becoming a sales success. The technique I eventually worked out has made perfume creation surprisingly easy. Thanks to it, I am never at a loss for creating new perfumes. Although some sort of apology should be in order for the seemingly inordinate conceit of what I have just set forth, all my laboratory colleagues and all of those who have come to us for tuition can vouch that I've stated nothing but the truth. Also, I firmly believe that the simplicity and ready applicability of my method will become fully apparent once I disclose my views on organized creative perfumery. Perfumery at present is at a crossroads. The number of trained perfumers tends to decrease since the long apprenticeship required appears an insuperable obstacle to most young people who cannot afford to wait long enough before earning a living. Such a situation should be remedied at all costs. While it is not to be expected that originality can be taught or that the potential sales appeal of a novel composition will be apparent to the young perfumer before he has gained the experience which only time will bring, it is nevertheless of prime importance that the apprentice perfumer be given help and guidance for coordinating his first attempts in the field of perfume formulation. There is no mystery in the way that I work. Over the past 35 years, more than 100 students, both French and foreign, have taken courses in perfumery in the company's laboratory at Grasse, and have been taught according to the simple method which I originally devised for myself. I am here trying to record the result of 50 years of sometimes disappointing, but often most rewarding experiences, in the hope that my young colleagues will find therein new possibilities for future creations and will see their enthusiasm increase tenfold when their efforts are crowned with success. Since without enthusiasm, there can be no perfumer. Perfumery and art. Actually, what is perfumery, and how should it be understood? Perfumery is an art, not a science, as many seem to believe. A scientific background is not necessary for the perfumer. Scientific knowledge may even sometimes prove an obstacle to the freedom required in perfume creation. A creative perfumer should use odorous materials in the same way a painter uses colors and give them opportunity for maximum development and effect. Although it is understood that potential reactions such as discoloration within the ultimate formulation and also the stability of the perfume should be given due consideration. This is about the only use the perfumer will be able to make of his scientific training, if any. The perfumer's only tool is his nose. I was first called Mr. Nose in the USA about 20 years ago, but any one of us is a potential Mr. Nose, since in perfumery, there is just no privileged nose. Anyone may acquire a highly developed sense of smell, as this is merely a matter of practice. A good nose, that is, an excellent olfactory memory, is not sufficient for producing a good perfumer. By the term a nose is meant a perfumer who is able to distinguish a pure product from unadulterated product, who can tell lavender 50% from lavender 40%. I myself, in spite of my long experience, but am a beginner in comparison to the old noses I met in Graz at the beginning of my career, and who were able to detect olfactorily the geographical area where a given oil of neroli or lavender came from. Olfactory training is of prime importance and should never be neglected or interrupted. Our own perfumers make it a strict rule to test their knowledge of perfume materials, and this is why a half hour is set apart for this exercise, which we will perform in a truly competitive spirit. Let it be emphasized again that no nose can be said to be better than one another, and that it is merely a question of olfactory memory for which daily training is not only necessary, but indispensable. Olfactory studies. Thus, the training of a beginner who knows nothing about perfumery should begin with the olfactory study of all odorous materials, both natural and synthetic. In order to facilitate such a study, the beginner will first be given to smell contrasting odors, and later materials belonging to a certain odor family. Elsewhere are given 2 tables relating to olfactory studies, according to such requirements. Learning to smell his smelling strips, to identify and to distinguish from one another all odorous materials, the beginner will soon notice that the odor of the products changes with time, that the rate of evaporation is not the same for all products. Top, middle, and base notes. Therefore, the next step will be for him to establish a classification of odorous materials according to their volatility. While such a classification could be established scientifically, the apprentice perfumer will soon attain unexpected proficiency by forgetting any technical information he may have and by establishing his classification for himself, as I had to 40 years ago. On the smelling strips will first be inscribed the date and time at which the drop of odorous material was deposited thereon, and later the date and time at which the product on the strip will begin to lose its main characteristic, its typical odor. When proceeding thus, no consideration should be taken of the ultimate off odors, such as terpenic notes or the like. This technique will soon make it apparent for the student that while some products are very volatile and lacking in tenacity, others are of intermediate volatility and tenacity, and others still are of low volatility and high tenacity. Such data will then readily be set forth in tabular form, all available, all odorous materials being listed under 3 headings, as shown in the table below. Classification according to volatility. These are just some examples here. Very volatile products lacking tenacity, considered top notes, would be amyl acetate, bois de rose, linalool, pentylenyl acetate, lemon, lavender, bergamot, orange, coriander, tarragon, laurel nobilis, petite grain from lemon tree, etc. Products of intermediate volatility and tenacity, modifiers of base notes, basil, terpineol, petite grain paragrey, galbanum, verbena, thyme, geraniol acetate, juniper, tansy, penylethyl alcohol, geraniol, absolute lavender, citronellol, neroli, rose Bulgarian, ylang, geranium, aldehyde C8, C9, C11, and C12, cloves, etc. Products of low volatility and high tenacity, base notes, methyl-ionone, absolute orange flower, clary sage, amyl salicylate, absolute jasmine, benzyl salicylate, cedarwood, aldehyde C16 and C18, sandalwood, artificial musks, absolute oak moss, vetiver and derivatives, patchouli, celery, etc. The student will then have to be taught how to use this table. As set forth above, I have termed very volatile products lacking tenacity as top notes, products of intermediate volatility and tenacity, modifiers, and products of low volatility and high tenacity, base notes. The reasons for this choice in terms are the following. As indicated by their name, the base notes will serve to determine the chief characteristic of the perfume, the scents of which will last hours on end and will be essentially responsible for the success of the perfume, if any. Anyone even remotely familiar with perfume materials is aware that all products of low volatility and high tenacity, such as vetiver, oak moss, patchouli, the methyl ionones, and the like, give off a rather unpleasant smell when freshly deposited on the smelling strips. But, on the other hand, the scent given off during subsequent stages of evaporation is excellent. This is the reason for the use of modifiers of intermediate volatility and tenacity, which will serve to change the unpleasant top note of the base products. Finally, the very volatile top notes lacking tenacity will serve to impart to the perfume composition a very pleasant odor on opening the bottle. For illustrative purposes, let us take an example, the creation of a Chypre note. Creating a Chypre note, the accord between bases. Absolute oak moss is the basic raw material for a Chypre note. It belongs to the series of products of low volatility and high tenacity, or base notes. Others of the more common materials belonging to the series are products such as the ionones and methyl ionones, vetiver, patchouli, cistus, labdanum, and the like. Therefore, we must choose among these products which will blend with absolute oak moss and impart an original characteristic to our perfume. We shall begin our study of this accord in the following manner. We shall select a second product belonging to the series of base notes, whichever was the most appropriate for blending with absolute oak moss. In the present case, we shall use, for example, absolute cistus colorless, or a similar product such as ambergris 162b, and we shall prepare a series of accords containing both constituents in the following ratios. Absolute oak moss, 9 parts, ambergris 1. Absolute oak moss, 8 parts, ambergris 2. Absolute oak moss, 7, 3, 6, 4, 5, and 5, etc. We shall not test combinations beyond the 5-5 ratio, since the following ratios of materials of absolute oak moss and ambergris in the ratio of 4-6, 7-3, 8-2, and 9-1 would no longer produce an accord based on oak moss, but an accord based on ambergris. We shall then choose between the 5 accords based on oak moss and, for example, shall decide on the following. 6 absolute oak moss and 4 ambergris. Since any Chypre note should also have a musk-like character, we shall add a certain amount of musk ketone or of musk ambrette to the above accord. Thus the base of the desired Chypre note will be as follows. 6 absolute oak moss, 4 ambergris, 1 musk ketone. When smelling this blend on the smelling strip, we shall notice that its immediate effect is rather unpleasant, although this will fairly rapidly disappear and be replaced by a pleasant, long-lasting note essentially characteristic of the personality of the ultimate perfume. The modifiers. How can we subdue, or rather adjust, this unpleasant note? We shall immediately find a solution to the problem by studying the table giving the classification of odorous materials according to volatility. Among the products of intermediate volatility and tenacity, we shall find which product or products will be best suited for blending with our accord between bases. We shall choose a floral note, a rose note for example, rose absolute. This rose note will subdue the immediate effect of our accord between bases and make it more pleasant. It will play its part as a modifier of base notes, and this is the reason why we have termed the products of intermediate volatility and tenacity modifiers. To the rose note, we shall add a trace of absolute civet so as to impart a slightly animal shading to the Chypre note. At this stage, the formula is as follows. Modifiers, 3 absolute rose, 1 absolute civet in a 10% solution. Bases, 6 absolute oak moss, 4 ambergris, 1 musk ketone. The top note. Our formula, however, is not yet complete. We must add to it a top note, which will produce the immediate effect when smelled upon opening the bottle. This note is fairly important since the potential buyer is easily influenced by it, with or without reason. as in no case can the top note be the characteristic note of the perfume. This study is far easier than the study of the accord between bases, since the series of very volatile products lacking tenacity contains many odorous products, most of which possess very pleasant notes. The study of the accord between the top notes can be carried out as set forth above for the base notes, but with much more freedom and fantasy. Combinations in this case are countless and may be left entirely to the perfumer's initiative. As with base notes, we may study several accords between 2 or 3 notes, or even 4. Let us, for example, after testing various combinations, decide upon the use of sweet orange and bergamot in the following amounts: 4 sweet orange, 1 bergamot. Thus, the extremely simple formulation of our Chypre note may be written down as follows. Top notes, 25%, 4 sweet orange and 1 bergamot. Modifiers, 20%, 3 absolute rose, 1 absolute civet, 10% solution. Bases, 55%, 6 absolute oak moss, 4 ambergris, 1 musk ketone. It is understood that the above is not a complete formula, but that it is nearly given for the purpose of illustrating the methods set forth in this paper. Proportions. Percentages of the 3 groups of products, bases, modifiers, and top notes. This percentage is extremely important. It is, for the major part, responsible for the tenacity of the perfume. A perfume containing 20% of bases, 30% of modifiers, and 50% of top notes will lack tenacity, since the percentage of bases would be relatively too low as compared to that of the more volatile modifiers and top notes. Therefore, the proportions are selected so as to obtain a balanced evolution during evaporation. Extension of the above formulation. We shall now examine how this Chypre note formula could be completed or modified. Let us first consider the base notes. We have already realized the accord: absolute oak moss, ambergris, musk ketone. We might, for example, add to it vetiver, which will result in the following accord: absolute oak moss, ambergris, vetiver, musk ketone. And we shall endeavor to find the proper ratios of ingredients as follows: absolute oak moss, ambergris, vetiver bourbon, musk ketone in a 4:4:4:1 ratio. Absolute oak moss, ambergris, vetiver bourbon, musk ketone in a 6:3:3:1 ratio. Then a 3:6:3:1 ratio. Then a 3:3:6:1 ratio. Thus, when studying the above accord, the main characteristic will be imparted by oak moss in experiment B, by ambergris in experiment C, and by vetiver in experiment D. The student perfumer will also be able to choose between the following accords: A, absolute oak moss, ambergris, patchouli; B, absolute oak moss, ambergris, methyl-ionone; C, absolute oak moss, patchouli, vetiver; or D, absolute oak moss, methyl-ionone, vetiver, etc. According to his preferences with respect to the main odorous characteristic of the base of the Chypre note he wishes to create. Obviously, the use accords could be increased to contain 4, 5, or 6 notes. It is therefore apparent that this method offers endless possibilities for creating new notes and new perfumes, the perfumer being entirely free to use any odorous material in these accords, provided, however, that such materials are selected from the series of base notes. Such complete freedom in the choice of the starting odorous materials may also be given to the beginner. Whatever the type of formulation, once we feel the accord between bases is completely and fully satisfactory, we shall have to reconsider our first selection of modifiers. In our first tentative Chypre note formula, we might, in place of rose note, use an orange note, a jasmine note, or any other floral note such as lily of the valley or carnation. Again, top notes should be also similarly adjusted. For the purpose of illustrating the procedure used for such adjustments, a series of modifications is given below. The original Chypre note formulation: sweet orange, bergamot, absolute rose, absolute civet; absolute oak moss, ambergris, musk ketone. First modification: sweet orange, bergamot, orange flower absolute, absolute oak moss, ambergris, absolute jasmine, musk ketone. Second modification, bergamot, laurel nobilis, angelica seeds, juniper berries, muguet, absolute oak moss, vetiver, patchouli, ambergris, aldehyde C14, absolute jasmine, musk ketone. Third modification, bergamot, sweet orange, absolute rose, absolute oak moss, amber liquid, methyl ionone, vetiver, patchouli, absolute jasmine, musk ketone. Fourth modification, bergamot, lemon, linalool acetate, jasmine, 1103, geranium African, orange flower, 1103, aldehyde C9, C10, and C11, absolute oak moss, gardenia invar, sterol acetate, vetiver, ambergris, musk ketone. Thus, modifications of the original formulation may be carried out endlessly, although the resultant blend is always within the scope of shipper notes. An entirely different perfume is obtained each time. However, this result can only be achieved provided the original formula is written down as suggested above in the following order: top notes, modifiers, and base notes. The specific example given above of the successive steps of perfume formulation shows how any particular type of perfume may be endlessly varied. But the method applies just as well when the perfumer wishes to obtain novel perfumes from a basic formula established to contain accords of which he is especially fond. Aids to metamorphosis. In this respect, I shall describe an experiment with which our former students are well familiar with, and which might be called a brief lesson in perfumery. I first write down with black pencil a very simple formula containing, let us say, about 8 products, and which results in a very acceptable perfume. To this formula, I then add new products, the names of which I write down with a red pencil. Thus, a second perfume is produced, while the proportions and the constituents of the first formulation remained unchanged. Pursuing this ensuing experiment, I added a new series of products to the second formula just obtained, writing down the names with a blue pencil. It is understood that these new products contain top notes, modifiers, and base notes, again without affecting any change in the products making up the first 2 formulations. A third perfume is produced, which is also entirely different from the others. And the experiment might go on endlessly by mere addition of products. At this point, I feel the subject of accessory products should be mentioned. What are accessory products? As far as I'm concerned, products in this series are those which, owing to their typical odor or to their high scenting power, cannot be used in large amounts in an accord between bases or between modifiers, but those whose presence in a formulation in more or less trace results in a complete change in the character of the latter and imparts to it a unique cachet. Examples of such products are aldehydes, C12 and C14, sterol acetate, isobutylquinoline, galbanum, cascarilla, and the like. However, although I have just recommended to use such products with moderation, this is not to be taken as a standing rule. Aldehyde C12, for example, proves to be an exception, and it should be known that some products, such as geranium, give most successful blends with as much as 50% of it. The advantages which may be derived from the use of accessory products are therefore readily apparent, and it would be pointless to discuss them at greater length in the present paper. But such considerations bring me quite naturally to mention an error which is quite common in young perfumers. Well-rounded or characterless. Our eager would-be perfumers seem to feel that they are under obligation to produce well-rounded perfumes. In other words, that they should subdue or hide any predominating odorous material. I believe this is actually the worst mistake the perfumer could be guilty of, since this desire for attaining maximum equilibrium in a perfume results in a subdued, characterless, finished composition. One should never believe before actually experimenting that a formulation contains an excess of a given product. Such excess may quite possibly be due to the lack of some other product. Dominantly effective notes in perfumes should be neither feared nor deliberately avoided. They are a perfumer's own secret, and such faults have quite often been responsible for tremendous commercial success. As a matter of fact, when the perfumer feels the amount of a basic product should be increased in a formulation, he should increase this original amount 2-fold, 3-fold, even 10-fold. This will afford him the almost unhoped-for opportunity of hitting an outstanding accord. This can always be reduced at a later stage, but the perfumer will know at once what results can be expected from the use of an excess of absolute oak moss, of vetiver, of methylenone and the like in the ultimate formulation, an excess which sometimes will pay. Sharp contrasts and fashions. At present, to meet with success in perfumes should actually explode. At present, to meet with success, perfumes should actually explode all over, so to speak. Modern perfumery requires contrasts, sharply characterized olfactory values. The perfumer should be totally unprejudiced, should entirely disregard his own tastes. Woe to him if he hates vetiver, if he cannot stand aldehydes. He should be aware that there are no incompatibilities in perfumery, that apparently clashing materials will blend successfully on addition of another product playing the part of binding agent and making their odors compatible. The creative perfumer should, above all else, consider the clientele's tastes. The commercial success of the new perfume of the novel Accord is essentially dependent on his original ideas, on his brainwaves. I have often been asked about the question, what is the latest fashion in perfumery? There is no fashion in perfumery. Only actual sales success dictate the fashion. A good perfumer is a perfumer who knows how to create a bestseller. The invaluable Accord. Great perfumers, like great concert pianists, should make it a strict rule to practice scales, in other words, to study possible accords between cases, since only therefrom can they derive the necessary technique conducive to virtuosity. While this is an overwhelmingly all-embracing task, an effort should be made, however, to reduce it to less gigantic and more readily accessible proportions. It is not necessary when studying accords based on shipper notes, for example, to consider the combinations of absolute oak moss with all existing odorous products. The perfumer will select the odorous raw materials he will see fit to use in his creation of a shipper note, and is only from such materials that he will study the satisfactory accords between bases. But although I have stated at the beginning of this paper that in perfumery, miracles are few and far between, I must say that this actually is where the true miracle emerges. The very selection a perfumer makes of raw materials to be used as ingredients in a new formulation is the best of all possible standards for appraising the originality. The initiative and the genius of the creative perfumer, on which the success of the new perfumers is entirely dependent, and while it is possible to devise a method which will enable the apprentice perfumer to understand and to acquire some sort of the technique, in perfumery, as in many other fields, many will be called but few chosen, since the essential qualities which lead to success cannot be taught, any more than can be taught enthusiasm, the joy of living and of creating, and the love for one's calling. These are innate qualities without which there is no great perfumer. There is not much more I can say about the method I devised for my work, and it is up to my readers to take over where we left off. On the basis of the method I set forth in the previous paper, they may study accords with the products other than absolute oak moss, that is, accords with vetiver, patchouli, sandalwood, methylenone, etc. Unless they find the work deadly dull from the start, they will enjoy many months of systematic research from which they will draw many useful lessons. My own experiments with absolute oak moss have already passed the 1,000 mark, and at least as many, if not more, remain to be carried out, since such investigations are endless. That's the end of part 1. I appreciate you listening. I will read the other 2 parts, but I will separate them so you can more easily go back through and read a chapter at a time.